Hi, my name is Kelly, and this paper will focus on how to ethically obtain informed consent from people with intellectual disabilities who are involved in research in order to increase their participation. Okay, let's start by answering three questions about informed consent. First, defining it. Informed consent is a legal construct based on an individual's ability to meet certain criteria related to cognitive ability in order to make a decision. Where did informed consent come from? Consideration of an individual's entitlement to freely consent after making an informed choice has its basis in medical practice in the 1960s. Obtaining informed consent is presently a requirement of all healthcare interventions. However, cultural differences between countries may dictate consent procedures. And is it something I need to pay attention to as a behavior analyst? The answer to that question is yes. The concept of informed consent is part of professional ethics codes, including that of behavior analysts. According to the Ethics Code for behavior analysts involved in research, all relevant state and federal laws must be adhered to when conducting studies with people with intellectual disabilities. Behavior analysts are obligated to inform participants with intellectual disabilities that their involvement is voluntary, in addition to educating them about all potential risks. The goal here is protection from physical and psychological harm. If behavior analysts find themselves working with people with intellectual disability who are unable to give informed consent, they must obtain permission from a legal representative. As with any topic in ethics, a discussion of costs and benefits is in order. So let's talk about some of the costs and benefits of increasing participation of people with intellectual disabilities in research. Because of low participation, many findings resulting from research studies cannot be applied to people with intellectual disabilities. This population's unfortunate exclusion can be deemed discriminatory and disempowering. The chance to contribute to the body of scientific knowledge would bring about a sense of autonomy and social responsibility among participants with intellectual disability. Other indirect benefits of this population's participation in research studies include diversion from routine, opportunities to meet new people, and greater access to professional care and support. It is true that the cognitive limitations and social powerlessness experienced by this population places them at higher risk of exploitation within the research process. It seems that the benefits of greater inclusion of people with intellectual disability in research far outweigh the costs, provided certain cautionary measures are taken. Until recently, healthcare professionals and others working directly with people with intellectual disabilities held a more powerful role, whereas people with intellectual disabilities were unlikely to make their own decisions. Vulnerable populations were historically subject to exploitation and rights violations in the name of research. One well-known example of this is the series of studies conducted in 1966 with children at Willowbrook, a former state school for children with intellectual disabilities. These child subjects were injected with the hepatitis virus in order to track its progression. The study continued even after immunization was developed. One of the researchers behind this study claimed to have obtained consent from parents of the children. However, it is believed that parents were coerced. Other historical examples of the participants' right to informed consent being violated are radiation experiments conducted on children with intellectual disabilities from the 1940s to the 1960s, and the Tuskegee syphilis study involving African American men from 1932 to 1972. The Nuremberg trials publicized the sterilization, euthanasia, and medical experimentation carried out by the Nazis during the Second World War. In 1949, as a result of these unspeakable atrocities, the Nuremberg Code of Ethical Practice made it necessary for human participants in research to give their voluntary consent. German law failed to protect the human rights of people with intellectual disabilities during the war. Approximately 400,000 people with various disabilities were forcibly sterilized to prevent their procreation. Past catastrophic mistakes of researchers have fortunately led to better treatment of individuals with intellectual disabilities, with the right to informed consent in mind. The conduct of researchers who employ human subjects has been under closer scrutiny of research ethics committees since the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. This declaration formed the foundation for guidelines developed by various countries with the goal of protecting people from exploitation caused by research. Modern research ethics guidelines are impacted significantly by this declaration, as they seek to uphold the protection of human rights as a core underlying principle. Informed consent is central to the Helsinki Declaration. Principles therein ensure individuals have sufficient information to make choices, are capable of making decisions about participation, and are in positions where decisions can be made autonomously and voluntarily. The disability rights movement commenced in the 1970s, although there were earlier activists for people with disabilities. The movement emphasized the importance of inclusion of people with disabilities using the following slogan: "Nothing about us without us." Okay, let's talk about informed consent in research today. My first bullet point is what researchers think. Researchers have expressed disdain over apparent overregulation by research ethics committees involving people with intellectual disabilities. Researchers frequently assume authority to make decisions about who should be researched on without properly examining the cost of vulnerable participants' rights, well-being, and autonomy. An unintended consequence of the protections we talked about in the last slide was a shift to overprotective attitudes toward people with intellectual disabilities. The point is, many vulnerable people remain unprotected from negative impacts of research, despite protections in place. If inclusion in research of people with intellectual disabilities is to be increased, research practices must be brought in line with human rights frameworks. This means treating members of this population with the utmost respect and dignity. Participants with intellectual disabilities are entitled to appreciation and fair compensation for their valuable contribution to the research body. Respecting dignity can be fostered by creating visible opportunities for members of this population to benefit from research. Data and findings from studies involving people with intellectual disabilities can potentially influence public health policy and improve quality of life. The creation of public health research aims and dissemination materials which promote disability rights principles can help lead to a more inclusive community. The fostering of collaborative relationships between researchers and people with intellectual disabilities may promote participation in research by increasing interest. A balance needs to be found between protection and empowerment for people with intellectual disabilities. Members of this population ought to be able to exert as much control over their lives as possible. Additionally, researchers need to be willing to provide explanations of how participants with intellectual disabilities are assessed on their ability to give consent, given their cognitive limitations. Various accommodations can be employed to ensure people with intellectual disabilities can safely participate in research studies. Okay, in this slide I'm just going to summarize some of the findings I came across on how to obtain informed consent from people with intellectual disabilities in an ethical manner. As I mentioned in the last slide, there needs to be a balance between protection and empowerment. I won't go too much into that since I already discussed it in the last slide. Second point is removal of barriers. Some of the barriers I came across were comprehensibility, accessibility to consent materials and instruments, communication issues, and power struggles. Some of the ways that these barriers can be destroyed are modification of the language used on these consent materials and instruments, modeling research procedures prior to the study to make participants more comfortable, changing instrument delivery formats. An example of that would be using oral communication or computer-assisted tools, using visuals, and maybe even working with people with intellectual disabilities themselves to design research materials. These are just some of the many ways that barriers to people with intellectual disabilities giving informed consent can be removed. The third bullet point is improvement of communication. There was a lot of material on this, so I'll just summarize. The general focus was an informal communication method between the researcher and the individual participant. The researcher needs to have strong interpersonal skills so that they can better assess the needs of the individual with intellectual disability. One example I liked was the researcher or anyone involved in the research providing reminders throughout the study that you can say no at any time. You can leave at any time because a participant with intellectual disability may not know that they can say no. So a reminder like that may be helpful to improve communication. Fourth bullet point is greater independence. It's important to apply a person-centered philosophy throughout the research process so that the individual with intellectual disabilities has the utmost level of autonomy. The fifth bullet point is education or training. As I said before, individuals with intellectual disabilities may not even know what their rights are or may forget, so it's important to give that reminder. Specialized training could involve assertiveness. This may especially be helpful for adults with intellectual disabilities who struggle with issues related to their independence. Maybe they've had their parents care for them and make decisions for them their whole lives, so they're not used to making decisions for themselves. It is possible for people with intellectual disabilities to understand research study disclosure provided it is presented in simple language as part of a dialogue. I touched on that before. Informal communication between the researcher and the individual, making it a dialogue, making sure they understand every step, clear and concrete. Next point is behavioral consent. I thought this was interesting. They did a study on one of the studies I researched. I think it was on blood tests. This study found that many subjects did not wish to have more information about the blood test. And these subjects had intellectual disabilities, just to clarify. They were content with having the healthcare professional make the decision for them. So consent was assessed behaviorally. Basically, this can be done by observing and paying close attention to the behavior of the participant. Are they willing, or do they have any fears? A lot of times you can tell this through the behavior if they're hesitant. And then my final point on this page is surrogate consent. This was kind of a last resort throughout my research because, like I said, there needs to be a focus on autonomy and independence. But in many cases, a surrogate consent can be used, hopefully with a person who knows the individual well. Thank you for listening. There was a lot of information I came across, so I obviously didn't cover everything. Hopefully it made sense to you. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to interact with you over the discussion board. Have a great night.